Well, 2 rounds of the NHL playoffs are officially complete, and we are now a little over halfway home before we crown a 2022 Stanley Cup champion. Welcome to the J&J Podcast, where we discuss all things hockey from around the world. I'm Jackson Starr, joined alongside Jake Titus, and today we will start by discussing, as per usual, the news from around the league, not necessarily pertaining just to the playoffs and the series that are going on right now. We'll follow that up by a recap of each second round series, and then discuss the conference finals matchups which are taking place right now. It is currently Friday, June 3rd. It is 1-0 in the series between the Rangers and the Tampa Bay Lightning. It is 2-0 Colorado over the Edmonton Oilers, with that series shifting back to Edmonton. But first, we got to start with some news from around the league, and it's that time of year, and it's coming quite close. The draft is coming up, and the interviews are taking place with some teams going on. Shane Wright, Juraj Slafkovsky, that discussion about who's going to go first, who's going to go second, who will go third, and beyond in the NHL draft. The Devils potentially trading their second overall pick. Who are the teams that are in the mix for that pick? A lot of discussions going on. Jake, I'll welcome you in here. What to make of all this draft interview discussion, Shane Wright, Juraj Slafkovsky, and just kind of a little bit of a draft preview here before we kind of dive into it more after the playoffs.
Well, first overall, I mean, it seems like a lock that it's going to go to Shane Wright. Obviously, you don't want to lock it in. Because there's a lot of great talent, around there. Slafkovsky, Logan Cooley as examples. A lot of teams that are, especially like lottery teams, are currently doing their draft interviews right now, as you said. One of which being the Montreal Canadiens, the other of which being the Ottawa Senators. The Sens, of course, have number 7. And originally they were not rumored to move their pick, but then Pierre Dorion did say that the pick is now in play. Of course, they're trying to get a top 6 forward, but after a few posts on Instagram and Twitter by Sens Media showcasing them interviewing Slafkovsky, there's been a lot of rumors around the Sens crowd that perhaps they could trade up for the second overall pick. What would be in that package is, of course, a mystery. I would assume some more prospects to help further along the New Jersey Devils rebuild, maybe some roster players as well. Mm-hmm. But very interesting that the Ottawa Senators are okay with posting the fact that they're interviewing Slafkovsky and Noah Warren was the other one on their Twitter. I think it's great for spinning debates, but I don't know. I think it's interesting, and of course you have more to say about like what's going on with the Montreal Canadiens and their interviews with Slafkovsky, Wright, and Cooley.
Yeah. Well, I think it's interesting. I believe it was Kent Hughes who mentioned that they had a good interview with Wright, or they had a good dinner with Wright, spoke of the importance of kind of getting to know the personalities of the players when taking guys out for dinner. They didn't have a dinner with Slafkovsky, they just interviewed him. But apparently, according to Slafkovsky, that went quite well. He mentioned that earlier today. So, it's an interesting debate. I don't know who it was who tweeted it out, but someone definitely said that out of any year to have the first overall pick, this is probably the hardest year, just based on, the projections of who's going to go where. You mentioned to me earlier, Jake, before we started recording, that the safe pick is Right. And I'm thinking for the Habs, that's probably the best way to go, just because, the draft's in Montreal.
Yeah.
The center is always a position that's very difficult to build around.
And it's a position that's always in need as well.
Exactly.
Yeah.
No matter how much depth you have at that position, which the Habs are lacking to an extent, it's always a position that you could develop at, as you mentioned. And, it's in Montreal, you're in front of your fans. Wright's the projected number 1. I think that's the safest pick that you make if you're the Habs. But there's an argument to be had. Slafkovsky has obviously had some great showings on the world stage at the World Championships and at the Olympics. So, there's a debate to be had. Obviously, again, something that I've spoken about in the past is the Habs are trying to build a culture. They're trying to build a winning culture. They're trying to build a certain amount of, a certain way to win that hasn't been seen over the past few years. And Wright kind of fits the billing of a leader. He was a captain in Kingston. So I don't know. I think that's a safe pick. That's the way they go. But there's a lot of discussion to be had about it. And obviously we'll dive more into it, me and you, on the podcasts coming up. Mm-hmm. So, lots of discussion going on around the draft and the interviews coming up.
But
so we'll move. Yes, go ahead.
Just real quick, I do want to mention that there's been, a couple of discussions surrounding Wright, Slafkovsky, and Cooley. I think
Yeah.
most prospect models actually suggest that Logan Cooley has the more offensive projectables. I do not remember
Hmm.
what his projectables were, but they were certainly like, top six and first line guys, which oftentimes with a lot of, you know, uh, kind of prospect comparables,
Yeah.
especially if you're looking at like their draft year. It's guys who may or may not be, great. It's usually guys that are like third liners, fourth liners with the occasional first or second liner, thrown in. Logan Cooley, I'm pretty sure his top five comparables were all at least top six players, which I think is a really good sign for him being a
Yeah.
very good player. So, of course, there's reason for him to go first overall. Shane Wright, of course, he got the exceptional status. Um,
Hmm.
Justified as well. Fantastic first year in the OHL. But, of course, with his development being potentially skewed because of missing a whole season because of the pandemic. And there is some questions about, while yes, he is a leader and yes, he is a captain, is he really truly a leader? Because in a couple of the interviews he's had on NHL Network, he seemed like he's maybe a little bit more selfish, which of course could be
Yeah.
just a
Good
self-motivation
point.
thing, but, there's questions to be had. And Slavkovsky definitely is billing himself as a kind of a power forward out of Liga. He's drawn some comparables to guys like Mikko Rantanen, Patrick Laine, and Jesse Puljujärvi, all players who you'd want on a team, even for a guy like Jesse Puljujärvi, who's easily the worst of those three as
Yeah.
comparables. He's still a fantastic player. And Slavkovsky really knows how to get into the nitty gritty zones. He's able to work the puck in the corners. He's got a great shot, and he does have an NHL projectable shot. So there's a lot to like about the three prospects. I think a lot of
Definitely.
them will become, or sorry, all three of them will become good NHL players. It's just really trying to find what works best for Montreal at number one.
Yep, I definitely agree. So we'll move right along, if that's perfectly good. Radulov is going to the KHL. Obviously, a long tenured NHLer, and this is a pretty big storyline. A guy that has struggled with injuries in the past as he's gotten older in Dallas, but played a pivotal role for the Stars with regard to getting them to the Stanley Cup final in 2020 and, of course, helping the Montreal Canadiens to a good season in 2016 and 2017. He's going to the KHL, signing the largest KHL contract in history, going back home. He started his career, of course, with the Nashville Predators before shifting his way over to Russia, then coming back to the NHL with the Habs, and then heading over to Dallas, playing out the remainder of what seems to be the end of his NHL career. A long-tenured NHLer and a guy moving over to the KHL largely for injury reasons, but an interesting storyline in Alexander Radulov's career path.
Yeah, I mean, he's always been a pretty big what if in the NHL. Of course,
Yes.
when he first started in Nashville, you did see a lot of the upside that you would see later on in his career in Dallas and in Montreal. He was very good. I think at points he even had point per game stints, but obviously he felt that maybe his role wasn't necessarily appreciated in
Mm-hmm.
Nashville and probably felt a little bit homesick. Hence, he went back to the KHL for the number of years before returning to the NHL to, I guess, prove his point. And boy, did he prove that point. I mean,
Yes.
uh, fantastic in Montreal, fantastic in Dallas. He'd been great up until last year, really, where he was even up
Mm-hmm.
11 points in 12 games. But of course, he was in dealing with back injuries, which set him out for the entirety of the season. And when you're 36 years old, um, you are coming off of injury and you aren't exactly playing your best hockey, especially as a European. It's much harder to find an NHL spot that would take you and give you the role that you want and the role that you feel like you deserve with all those years of experience in the league. And so I think him going back to the KHL was not necessarily a guarantee, but it was expected. I think him being the largest contract in KHL history, especially given the fact that, of course, the war in Ukraine has brought down the value of the ruble by so much.
Yes.
I do think it's a gamble on his part. It's very tough to say if like that contract will actually be worth anything once it's over in 2 years. But he's definitely going back because it's his home country. He's probably looking to finish his career over there. And furthermore, I think he feels like he has a little bit left in the tank, and I guess a point to prove again. So it'll be neat looking at what Radulov will be able to do back in the KHL.
Definitely so. Well, a feel-good story right after the Hurricanes got eliminated, not a feel-good story, but a feel-good story for them is that Jake Gardiner finally is ready to play, I should say, after 2 hip injuries and then 1 back surgery as well. He's finally ready to play. Obviously, a guy who's been under the microscope. He was very, very much scrutinized for his play in the playoffs in Toronto, comes over to Carolina, another guy who's kind of been derailed by injuries, and someone who's finally ready to be in the lineup for the Hurricanes or another team potentially come next season. So just a feel-good story for Jake Gardiner and him coming back to the lineup and being able to play again.
Oh yeah, I think there's one thing to be said. I think there's really there's 2 players that get scrutinized the most in hockey. 2 types of players. Number 1 is offensive defensemen, and number 2 is injured players. Players who are just coming off of injuries. And the worst part is that I guess, yes, of course, he could sharpen up defensively, even though that's not necessarily his style. Of course, he was originally a forward before he got drafted with the Anaheim Ducks, and so he made that position switch to defense because he felt like, well, if he's such a good quote-unquote defensive forward, or at least he's a net positive defensively, and he's so good offensively, he could really bring, a more well-rounded game to his team. Of course, in the NHL, you kind of want your defenseman to play defense, but of course, if you could put up points, then that's fine. But, with a lot of players, especially coming off of mobility injuries, you look at guys like Jared Cowan, of course, who retired at 25 because of hip injuries, and you look at the numerous amount of players that retired because of back injuries. I'm a bit worried for Jake Gardiner and what the kind of fan reaction will be of him next season. I think Jack Hahn on Twitter actually mentioned that back when, I believe in 2019, when he was coming off of knee surgery, and he was practicing with the Toronto Maple Leafs, which of course Hahn was a part of the organization. He said that watching him skate made him wince. So I do think that, especially out of most offensive defensemen, Jake Gardiner's the one that gets thrown under the bus a lot. Maybe it's because of his time in Toronto, but also, generally the idea or the perception of offensive defensemen in the league, especially if you're not like an elite one. But, it is nice to see him back, and it is nice to see him feeling at 100%, especially when, at points during the season, people were even considering that maybe he wouldn't be back. So it's great to see him back, and hopefully he could return in full form.
For sure. Well, another kind of big news story from around the NHL is the fact that Jason Spezza announced his retirement from playing in the NHL. He'll join the Toronto Maple Leafs in another position, but will not be on the ice for them anymore. Obviously, an Ottawa Senators legend, alongside Daniel Alfredsson and Danny Heatley, made up that terrific line during the 2007 playoffs. And a large question mark has to be had. Do the Sens decide to retire Jason Spezza's number? They obviously have retired Daniel Alfredsson and Chris Phillips' number. Do they put Spezza's number up into the rafters at Canadian Tire Center as well? Jake, what do you think?
It's a question to be had, especially within, the Sens fan, I guess, landscape. If you look at Sens Twitter, a lot of people are debating on this, and I think really it shouldn't be a debate. I think Jason Spezza, you look at what he's done for not just the team, you look at what he's done for the city of Ottawa in general, and I think he's a lock to have his number retired. Now, if you didn't know, he created programs for elementary school students and middle school students to get good grades and if they would be rewarded with Sens tickets, which actually did have a correlation to higher grades in the Ottawa area. So
Wow.
he's
How
done a
about
lot
that?
for the community, and if you just look at his on ice play, multiple time All Star. Of course, he was a part of the pizza line, which they were so good. So if you didn't know, basically, if the Ottawa Senators would score 5 points in a game, people would get a free slice of pizza. The thing is that the Ottawa Senators would score more than 5 points, or I believe it was the pizza line. Either way, they would achieve more than 5 points on a semi-consistent basis, so much so that Pizza actually had to increase the number to 6 because of the amount of free pizza that they were giving. So,
Wow.
yeah, Jason Spezza, absolute legend. I think it's only fitting that the player who he was traded for, Nick Paul, ended up, I guess, technically retiring him. But, I do wish him well on his future endeavors in Toronto, and I do think that his number should absolutely be retired. If Chris Phillips is there and Daniel Alfredsson's there, I think he should be there right with them.
I agree 100%, and I think next up in line could potentially be Erik Karlsson. But again, a conversation to be had there as well is, how much of an impact did he have both on the Sens and on the community as well, because that's obviously an important aspect. Alfredsson, obviously, a major player in the Ottawa community, and a guy who's just always been there as a Sens legend, the Ottawa Senator, in my mind, and at least I think a majority of Ottawa Senators fans. So yes, I do agree, Spezza should go up, and we will see if that is the case in the near future. We got to shift our focus to something a little bit more, I guess, negative, and that is the Boston Bruins. And oh boy, a lot of potential bad happening for the Boston Bruins, to put it bluntly. Bergeron's potentially retiring. That's obviously a storyline that we've spoken about on the podcast, as well as where he will go, potentially in free agency. Will he re-sign with the Bruins? Will he retire, as we've spoken about? Marchand's out till December. That came out in the news. And then a big news drop from Frank Saravalli and the Bruins today. McAvoy out until September. Matt Grzelcyk out until September.
December.
Mike Riley until December. Sorry. Mike Riley, that is definitely out, but should be back for the regular season, although he could miss some of training camp, so that could derail his lead up to the season. So that's basically the entirety, or a good majority, of the core, the back end for the Boston Bruins. That could potentially derail their season coming up completely and shift them to a potential non-playoff team, which we haven't really seen from the Bruins in a long time.
With Boston, I think with Bergeron, if Bergeron retired and Marchand was on injury, I think it's at least somewhat salvageable. I think you could definitely get a 1C in free agency, and you could definitely work around the cap so that when Marchand retires, when he returns, you are cap compliant.
Yes.
But with these injuries, I don't see it happening, and I see them struggling quite a bit to even make the playoffs next year, let alone be a contender like they were this year. I mean, the East is such a tough conference this past season, and it's likely to be at least similar next year. And, I mean, I just don't see it happening. I mean, the Boston Bruins are a defensively sound team, generally speaking. Their fourth line is notorious for being just an absolute shutdown line. But even then, like this past season, their fourth line wasn't playing as good as years prior. And when you consider that such important pieces like Charlie McAvoy, like Matt Grzelcyk, super underrated defensively, and Mike Riley, who, I mean, yes, most people see him as an offensive defenseman, but he can hold up his own end of the bargain defensively. This is a huge blow for the Boston Bruins. And it's so much of a blow that their top 6 next year could be abysmal. I mean, yes, they have Hampus Lindholm and they have Brendan Carlo. Hampus Lindholm, of course, is a guaranteed at least second pair defenseman, if not, you could argue, a top 4 defenseman. He's more of an offensive defenseman. He struggles in the defensive zone, but usually he makes up for it with his offensive play. Brandon Carlo, of course, is the complete polar opposite, complete shutdown. They'll be nice on a pair together, most likely. But after that, I mean, you see the Alcon Saboril, who still does have potential despite being 25 and having an injury history. But Derek Forber, who is making $3 million with a no trade clause, was terrible defensively. He was terrible offensively. He was really only good shorthanded, which I guess is not optimal for a guy who would likely be playing top 4 minutes. And then with that, you have Connor Clifton, who is an okay 6th defenseman. Again, third pair, it's not the worst, but after that, you might have to bring back a guy like Josh Brown, because really all that's left is just AHLers. And I think if Boston really wants to make the playoffs, especially in a conference like the East, with, teams like, I guess, Ottawa coming up, even though I don't expect them to make the playoffs next year, despite what their management says, and, with, of course, Toronto and all the other teams in that division, I just don't see it happening. I see the Boston Bruins just being a shell of their former selves, especially on the back end.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I'm curious to see what the managerial decisions this offseason are, just simply due to the fact that next year's draft is really strong, especially at the top of it. If you get a top 3 pick next year, it bodes well. So are you willing to sacrifice basically everything, throw in the towel, and potentially make a run at one of the top 3 guys in next year's draft and start the process of getting back to a point where you can, build something like what they've had for the past 10, 15 years? Or do they try to kind of, again, re-up with the guys that they have and salvage what they have? Usually that doesn't bode well for an organization, so it's going to be interesting to see what they do and the decisions they make.
Now, I do have to mention one thing about the Boston Bruins, though, is that their draft history is not particularly good either.
Very good point, yes.
This is a team that, well, yes, of course, they have guys like, Pasternak, who's come up in the organization relatively recently, even though he's 26, and Charlie McAvoy. But this is a team where a lot of their talent comes from guys who are either acquired overseas as free agents, they're acquired by trade, or they are acquired as undrafted college free agents. This isn't necessarily a team that, I guess, uses the draft to the ability of, let's say, for example, a Carolina Hurricanes or even a Florida Panthers. There's a lot of players that come through the organization that get drafted that don't pan out, especially compared to other teams. And so, if they do end up making this shift towards, I guess, more of a retool or a rebuild phase, even though the draft is projected to be very good next year, it's supposed to be very top-heavy and deep. My question is, are they actually able to use that to their advantage, or will they continue to struggle with their drafting? Because, of course, you look at their 2015 draft, and it's notoriously bad. And then you look at a lot of the more recent picks that they've made, and while, yes, a lot of their more high-end picks, like, Trent Frederick is likely an NHL player, not particularly good, though.
No.
And Urho Vakanainen is struggling to make a roster spot in Anaheim. Jack Studnicka's not looking particularly good. He's looking like more of a bottom 6 guy. A lot of the guys that they're drafting high are just average NHLers, if that.
Yeah.
And I think, a lot of times you do say, well, if you want to be a good team, you have to draft deep. You have to have good picks throughout the draft. But they're also not getting the help on the top end as well. So who knows? I think it's definitely storyline next year.
Yeah, I agree. A lot of question marks, and it's going to be interesting to see where the Bruins go from here. Well, let's move on to the playoffs and what's going on right now. We'll talk about the second round series first in the Eastern Conference with the Florida matchup, the Lightning and the Panthers. I don't really think anyone expected it to be this one-sided. Tampa dominated the Panthers. Florida's top guys didn't show up. Not really at all. They couldn't get much going. That's credit Vasilevskiy with that, or for that I should say, and Tampa's D overall for being able to shut down the top guys in Florida. But again, you have to look at the ability that they had to, get to a point like that, building up such a good season, beating the Caps, maybe not in the most convincing fashion, but getting by the Washington Capitals, getting to the second round in a series against the Lightning, against a team where last year in the playoffs they showed like they could fight against them. Out of any team that the Lightning played, besides the Islanders in last year's playoffs, the Panthers put up a good fight in their 6-game loss in for the first round of that series, or of that playoffs, I should say. So there was so much hype going in, and they lay a dud kind of like this. And, it's going to be very interesting to see where the Panthers go from here. A lot of guys potentially coming off the books, so it's going to be very, very intriguing to see what the Panthers do and if they're able to get back to a point like they were this year.
I look at a lot of the guys who are projected to leave. You've got guys like Mason Marchment, who, of course, is going to be asking for a major payday after this past season, only making, I think, under $1 million this past year, and being,
not a lot.
Fantastic. He's definitely going to be looking for a pretty good payday in free agency, so I don't see him returning. A guy like Ben Sherratt, I don't know if they'll be interested in him coming back. He wasn't necessarily terrible, but of course he wasn't what they paid for. And Marcus Nudivara, who's been injured for the majority of the year, it's very tough to see him come back as well. But despite all these players coming off the books, they don't have a lot of salary cap for next year. And so bringing back the big guns like, Claude Giroux is still a question mark. They will probably have to take a step back. I don't think it's going to be a major step back. But, I think they have to try to find ways to manage the cap better. That being said, Bill Zito is a genius, and so I'm sure he'll find ways to work around it. But I think one thing that's definitely holding them back is maybe not Sergei Bobrovsky, but that contract. Despite being a very good goaltender, he's still not really worth that money, and he's looking a lot like a 2017 price, where a lot of people were coming into question about, okay, he's a good goalie, but he's not worth the money. Should we try to offload him? Should we try to trade him? And, of course, Carey Price would go on to make the Stanley Cup Finals and have a wonderful run.
Yeah.
But I think it's a bit different there, because I feel like, when that question was being asked about Carey Price, it was more or less because, well, the team wasn't also supporting him, on the back end as well. Yeah. And so he was definitely looking a lot worse than he was playing, but of course he wasn't playing up to his contract anyway. And so that's the reason why the question circulated. Meanwhile, you have the Florida Panthers. You have a team that's dominant. They're dominant offensively. They're very good defensively. This was one of the better teams in the league, if not, they were the best. They won the President's Trophy. And Bobrovsky was fine. And do you want to pay, $10 million for a guy that's fine? It's tough. Goalie is the most valuable position in hockey. And despite that, did the value added of having Bobrovsky in net, especially in the playoffs, make up for the $10 million cap hit? I don't think so. And so I think they'll definitely be trying to look at ways to offload his contract in the offseason and explore goalies in free agency. I don't think Spencer Knight is just ready to make the jump, but I also feel like having a goaltender who maybe isn't locked in long term ahead of him, like a goalie on like a 2 to 3 year contract, I think it might give Spencer Knight a little bit more confidence to step up his game, because at least it'll look like, he will have the opportunity to be a starting goaltender, to be that elite goaltender he was projected to be when he was drafted at 15. And so, I think the first thing that they do is probably try and offload the Bobrovsky contract. I know it's going to be difficult. They may have to retain a couple $1 million on that contract just to get a deal done, or they might have to lose on the deal completely. But if it's what it takes for Florida to achieve postseason success, I think you got to go with it.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's an interesting issue, and it's one that can be dealt with in different circumstances, like you spoke about. But the first thing that I was kind of thinking about when you were talking was, they offload their first round pick unprotected next year for Ben Sherrod. They really throw in everything to go get Claude Giroux and put all of their guns really to UFAs who are done this year and then going for it this year, and they weren't able to do it. Was that too much too soon for a team that was on the rise and has been over the past couple of years, where they tried to achieve success maybe a little bit too soon in what they're trying to build? Not to say they didn't have a terrific team and have the ability to do something like that, but again, like you say, you have a guy in Spencer Knight who has the ability to come in and potentially be the star he was drafted to be. So was this maybe a little bit too? Were they reacting too soon to the circumstance they found themselves in, based on the success they had? Maybe, potentially, they take a step back next year. We shall see. But the Bobrovsky contract is an interesting one. The goaltending issue in Florida is an interesting one, and I'm curious to see where they go from here, just based on the lack of cap space they have and the amount of guys they have coming off the books. The key for them, though, is that they do still have guys like Barkov, Huberdeau, Ekblad, Uyghur, and that core still intact.
And
so
on relatively good contracts as well.
Exactly. So if you're able to still find a way to build around that core, there's no need to panic necessarily in the sense that this team will completely fall off a cliff. Those guys were terrific. Huberdeau had one of the best seasons any winger has ever had. So, it's there's no need to panic necessarily if you're Florida in my mind, but I still think there are signs of concern that they need to address this offseason, and we'll see if they do in fact do so. So moving on to the next series in the East, the Hurricanes and the Rangers. The Rangers taking it in Game 7, and the Hurricanes could not win one road game throughout the entirety of the playoffs. It is also the first time in in Carolina Hurricanes history that they lose a Game 7. They did lose when they were the Hartford Whalers. I believe the last one was back in 1985, but I might be wrong on that. Disappointment for the Hurricanes, also a team looking to go longer into the playoffs and maybe make a cup run, but they kind of got goalied on both ends of the ice. Shesterkin was terrific. Ranta was very, very solid, but just unlucky in nets with Ranta getting hurt, and an unfortunate circumstance in that regard for the Carolina Hurricanes.
Absolutely. It's just a testament to how good these teams are when really the only thing that we could talk about is just the goaltending. Because the forwards and the defense were really good for both teams throughout the majority of the series. It's just really, goaltending is the most important position in hockey for a reason. But, Anderson was out. He's been out since March. This was a guy that's... We didn't particularly know the injury. We knew it was a lower body injury. He's had issues with lower body injuries in the past. Turns out it was a knee injury. I believe it was an MCL tear. And so definitely not one of the better injuries to have. And so, it's really hard to imagine this series going any other way when you look at it from that point of view. I was hopeful that Anderson was coming back, but of course midway through the series, we end up finding out that he wouldn't be back for the entirety of the series. Antti Ranta, of course, unlucky. He wasn't... It's not that he was bad, it's just... He was given the short end of the stick, and then you add on the fact that he was injured. I believe he was injured twice. He was injured at one point, either during the series or in the last series, but was playing through it and then got injured and had to be taken out for Pyotr Kochetkov, who's a great goaltender, but just not ready for playoff hockey. Maybe he's an NHL backup next season. Maybe he's at that point of it in his development, but he's just not ready to play in the toughest stage of them all just yet. But I think one thing that needs to be said is that a lot of the depth pieces, especially the more higher profile ones on Carolina, have been getting thrown under the bus recently by Canes fans. You look at Jesperi Kotkaniemi as an example. You'd mentioned before the podcast, but also Martin Necas. This is a guy who last year had about 40 points in 53 games in the shortened season. Very, very good. About to break out as a potential first liner, which would have been huge for the Carolina Hurricanes. He did regress a little bit in his development with only 40 points in about 80 games. But again, that's not particularly bad in terms of production. I'm not too sure what his analytics were this past year, but judging by the way that Carolina Hurricanes fans have been reacting to comments that he made to Brindamore after the series was over, saying that he wanted to go back to center because he felt like he wasn't playing his best hockey and he wants to play his natural position next year. It sounds like Carolina Hurricanes are not too impressed with him, and actually some have been calling for the team to let him go, let him walk in free agency, despite being an RFA. So, I mean, they're certainly a team that next year they'll be good. They'll be in contention again. But this will definitely be one that they'll be looking at on the drawing boards for quite a while.
Yeah. It's going to be, for me, it's interesting to see if they take a step in the right direction or a step backwards, because, you know, you look at their year-by-year projection and kind of development. Last year they lose in 5 in the second round. This year they lose in 7 in the second round. And again, last year Vasilevskiy and the Lightning were on their way to a second straight Stanley Cup, and it really didn't look like anyone would stand in their way, at least at the point when the Hurricanes lost to them. This year, the Rangers were there for the taking, really. They played them well, the Hurricanes did, and you know, they just couldn't get by. So, you know, for me, this is kind of a step in the right direction in that sense. But again, you had home ice advantage at home. You looked like you were potentially coming home where you have been very, very good in the playoffs. The I don't exactly know the numbers, but I do remember the numbers for the Hurricanes in pretty much every category, penalty kill, power play, whatever it may be, was so much better at home than it was on the road. Like, it's a substantial difference. So, you know, you're coming home for Game 7, you look like you have it, and then you just get blown out of the water really at home. So, you know, it's an unfortunate way to end your season. And I think Elliot Friedman mentioned that post-game after that, you know, you have so much, you're so good at home in the playoffs, and you have so much potential coming home for that game to lay a dud like that. It's a tough way to end your season and a tough way to go into the offseason. And with the variables that you mentioned, it's going to be interesting to see where the Hurricanes go from here. They'll definitely be very competitive next year. Definitely one of the better teams in the National Hockey League. But still, where will they go from here? Will they take this in the right? Will the team take this in the right way? This loss, that is, in the right way, and be able to use it as momentum going into next year? We shall see. I think there's a lot of potential questions to be had for the Carolina Hurricanes going into next season. Moving on to the Western Conference, we have the St. Louis Blues and the Colorado Avalanche, the Avs, taking down the Blues in 6 games. A lot of storylines going around in that series, of course, with Nazem Kadri running into Jordan Binnington. But overall, to be said, the St. Louis Blues did give the Avs a tough time. The Blues really, really played a very, very solid overall style of play to shut down the top guys to an extent of the Colorado Avalanche. They did the best they could. But it wasn't enough. The Avs dethroned the Blues in this series and move on to the third round. But overall, strong signs for the Blues after what was a very good series win against the Minnesota Wild and then a good effort against this Colorado team.
Yeah, I think the Blues are definitely one of the tougher teams to play on a year-to-year basis. I think a lot of that goes to Craig Berube, but it also goes to the way that the team was built. They're, as we mentioned in the previous episodes, they are built for playoff hockey, and so they really did give Colorado one of the tougher tests that they've got. But of course, Colorado came up on the right side of it. They did, similar to Vegas last year, they did a very good job forcing the Avs to play at their level to kind of slow down their pace, but it ended up not being enough for St. Louis to get the edge. I think one of the big storylines throughout this playoffs has been whether they go with Husso, whether they go with Binnington, because you look at their goaltender outlook, and while yes, they do have a vast majority of prospects, of course, they're still a team that wants to contend, that wants to win the Stanley Cup once again, and so they're obviously looking for their number one, and if Binnington is not that number one with that contract, of course, they can't keep him. But I think with the way that this postseason has gone, And while, yes, Ville Husso did perform very well during the regular season, much better than Binnington, I think Binnington will be the St. Louis Blues starting goaltender going forward. I don't think there's a lot of risk to it. I do realize that he didn't have a great regular season, but I think, the ability to play in clutch games and perform well up until, of course, the injury, I think it's important to have, and it's more important than a goaltender that is unable to perform in the playoffs when it truly matters. Again, not to say Husso was bad, but, of course, Binnington has been playing very, very good, especially in the playoffs up to this point. And, if he does regress and he does kind of turn into a backup, I don't think it's necessarily the worst thing in the world. He does only have a couple more years left, and with guys like Joel Hofer in the system, who of course scored a goalie goal, but was also on Team Canada's World Junior team, and just a fantastic goalie prospect through and through. I don't think they'll be losing any sleep if they ended up making the wrong choice there, but I'd personally go with Binnington after this playoffs. I think he had a fantastic series, and I think that injury really changed the course of the series as well.
Yeah, definitely, I'd agree. Moving on to the other series, and another one that was projected to go longer maybe than it actually did, is the Battle of Alberta, the Oilers and the Flames. Disappointing loss for the Flames to an extent. A very, very good season for Calgary. They take down the Dallas Stars, who gave them a run for their money as well. In 7 games, they take down the Stars, and they go into this series that's all hyped up against the Edmonton Oilers, and they lose in 5 after really putting up a ridiculous offensive showing, winning 9-6 in Game 1. They lose 4 straight against the Oilers and go down into the offseason after losing in the second round. A lot of interesting storylines in this one. Markstrom was not very good in the series, at least not to the caliber that Smith was for the Oilers, not to say he was terrific at all points of the series. But, it's not so concerning for the Flames in the sense that it's the end of what they've built. They have the potential to re-up with this core and go for it again, potentially in the years to come.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one thing that definitely has to be mentioned is just the urgency. You look at Edmonton, and I mean, it feels really, really crude to say it, but it almost feels like there's like a ticking time bomb in Edmonton. Because each season that they miss the playoffs or they don't really get success, it's like, okay, is this the season where Connor McDavid is finally fed up and he decides, to go elsewhere or to request a trade, which it's a grim reality. But when you've got a player so talented, and you've got, yes, he's got Draisaitl, but you've got a core that just isn't up to snuff in the postseason up until this point, it's definitely a reality that becomes closer and closer with each season that moves forward. But the urgency was definitely there with the Edmonton Oilers this past season. I think Jay Woodcroft was a big part in that. His hire was definitely monumental for this team moving forward and throughout the playoffs. But they played really solid defensively, and they played very well offensively, of course, with McDavid and Hyman being true standouts, as well as Draisaitl and numerous others. But they just were too much for the Calgary Flames, a team that they don't have that urgency, because one of the things that Daryl Sutter essentially, I guess, not promised, but he guaranteed, was that this was a team that didn't need to win this year. They'd like to win, but they didn't need to. They had they didn't have a lot of assets in play, in the sense that there's not a lot of guys who are going to free agency. And if so, the guys that are going to free agency, like Gaudreau and Tkachuk, who are stars, don't get me wrong, these are the top players, quite literally, on the Calgary Flames. They're players who want to come back. And they're players who not just want to come back, but they want to stay. And for Gaudreau, this is monumental because, of course, there were rumors that he would go elsewhere, just as close as last season. So I think with Daryl Sutter, a player's coach nonetheless, but also a coach that really knows how to bring the best out of his players, especially come playoff time. I think even though that this was a disappointing loss to a rival, in the long run, this is a step forward. And I think, with the fact that they're in relatively safe waters with the salary cap, and with the fact that they do have Markstrom, who, yes, he didn't have a great series, but historically has been a great goaltender. This is a team that could definitely be one of the top teams next year, and they could definitely use this to fuel their motivation next year, to have that urgency, to really become the team that they were expected to be in this playoffs next year.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I do think that they have the ability to make a run next year and in the years to come. I think Gaudreau resigns, Kachuk stays, and they kind of, they have the ability to do it, and they will, I think, in the future. So no necessary concern for Flames fans going into next year. They just got to stay healthy, stay as healthy as they can, and, put, again, a consistent effort out there every night like they did this year. They were a very good team in the regular season, I should say, with regard to the success they had. So going to be interesting to see what they do next year. Moving on to the series that are going on right now, and we are going to do predictions later on for each series, even though they are underway. We'll kind of use what we've seen so far to kind of base what our predictions will be, but we're going to start off with the Eastern Conference Final, the Tampa Bay Lightning and the New York Rangers. We'll start off with Tampa. They came into these playoffs, I should say, and they finished the season with a record of 51, 23, and 8, total of 110 points. The playoff leaders in points are Nikita Kucherov, 4 goals, 11 assists, and 15 points in 12 games. Steven Stamkos has climbed to the second after having a good series against the Panthers, 5 goals, 5 assists, and 10 points in 12 games. And Victor Hedman, of course, the steady back-end man there for the Tampa Bay Lightning, 2 goals, 8 assists, and 10 points in 12 games played. The goaltender, of course, is Andrei Vasilevskiy. After a lackluster first round against the Toronto Maple Leafs, where he posted basically one very strong game, came back and had a ridiculous series against the Florida Panthers, that is, in a total of 12 games so far. Record of 8-4-0 with a .253 goals against average and a .923 save percentage for Andrei Vasilevskiy. Last year in the playoffs, of course, they defeated the Florida Panthers in 6, then Carolina in 5, and the Islanders in 7, followed by the Canadiens in 5. To win the Stanley Cup, I should say, for the second year in a row this year so far. As mentioned, they defeated the Toronto Maple Leafs in the first round, and now they sweep the Florida Panthers to head to the Eastern Conference Final against the New York Rangers. Some storylines for the Tampa Bay Lightning. Vasilevskiy was terrific, as mentioned, against the Florida Panthers, and just basically what we've seen from the entirety of the Tampa team going back for the past couple of seasons with regard to their depth, their top-line scoring, their defense, just overall all things clicking in a series against their cross-state rivals over there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the major keys, of course, is Vasilevskiy. Now, of course, last game he wasn't necessarily playing up to the best of his abilities, but as we know, whenever Vasi loses, especially in the playoffs, he's always due for a bounce-back game. And so It'll be very interesting to see if they are able to do that tonight. These are two teams that have very, 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 very good first lines. And I think the New York Rangers have been interesting because, coming into the playoffs, of course, they're not really a team that is considered to have great depth. Of course, they did add with guys like Andrew Copp and I do not remember his name, but he was on the Vancouver Canucks. Tyler Mott, sorry about that. But yeah. Tyler Mott, of course, they added as well. During the trade deadline, these are guys that they are relatively clutch players. They're players who you really need if you want to go on to a playoff run. But, of course, they weren't necessarily expected as a team to really make it that far. So I think they do have to treat this like it's a series against one of the top teams. With the way that the New York Rangers have been playing, they need that defensive consistency that they've got, that they had in round 1, and they need that goaltending consistency that they got in round 2. If they're able to shut down the New York Rangers, I think this series could easily go Tampa's way. If not, we could be seeing the Rangers in the Stanley Cup Finals.
Yeah, and on the topic of the New York Rangers, we're going to get to them in a moment, but just to add on to what you kind of said about the Tampa Bay Lightning, when they're down, you kind of basically mentioned that when Vasilevskiy loses, he's very good at bouncing back. that goes for the entirety of the Tampa team. You know, against the Leafs, they lost, they'd win. They lost, they win. Before having their backs up against the wall, going down 3-2 in that first round series, and then winning 2 straight to win the series. You know, historically, when they have their backs up against the wall and you doubt them, they respond by just winning, and they find a way to do so. So you know that again, that cannot be overshadowed, I believe, with the Tampa Bay Lightning. So we'll see if that comes into play against a Rangers team that has shown very early on in the series that they have the ability to compete with the Tampa Bay Lightning. So moving on to the Rangers, they came into the playoffs with a 52-24-6 record, 110 points there. So two teams with 110 points coming into the playoffs. Mika Zibanejad leads the way in points in the playoffs. 8 goals, 13 assists, and 21 points in 15 games. He's been terrific. Adam Fox, the defenseman, is second with 5 goals, 15 assists, and 20 total points in 15 games played. And Andrew Copp has been sneaky good for the Rangers. He's got 6 goals, 7 assists, 13 points in 15 games so far this playoffs. That includes, of course, Game 1. And the starting goaltender, of course, Igor Shesterkin, rounding up the Russian battle in goal here in the Eastern Conference Finals. In 15 games, Shesterkin has a 9-5-0 record, with a .264 goals against average and a .929 save percentage. Last playoff appearance for the Rangers prior to this one came in 2020 in the play-in when they got swept away by the Carolina Hurricanes. This year, they defeated the Penguins in 7, they defeated the Hurricanes in 7, and now they're going up against the Tampa Bay Lightning to try and go back to the Stanley Cup final for the first time since 2014. Shesterkin was terrific against Carolina, Jake, and they're going to need him to be just as good against the Tampa Bay Lightning. He was terrific, very, very solid in Game 1 of the series, and they need him to keep the way he's been playing up if they want to find their way back to the Stanley Cup final. Similarly to that of the Tampa Bay Lightning, they need Vasilevskiy. The Rangers need Shesterkin.
I think this is the perfect Stanley Cup Finals for people who don't watch hockey. And the reason why I am saying that is because in the East you have the battle of the arguably two of the best goaltenders in the league, in Igor Shesterkin and Andrei Vasilevskiy. And of course in the West, you have two of the best players in Connor McDavid and Nathan McKinnon in Colorado. And so I think it's just a testament to just how good these individual players are. And of course, yes, their teams are good as well, more so with the Colorado Avalanche and the Tampa Bay Lightning. But, you know, with guys like Connor McDavid and with guys like Igor Shesterkin, they've been proven to turn it up a level in order to secure games for their team, in order to secure those wins, especially in the playoffs this past season. I mean, Shesterkin, yes, he was a beast against the Carolina Hurricanes. He was also very good in the first round as well. The big question here with Shesterkin, though, is that, and this is a question that still has not been answered, is that he's still struggled on the road. And,
yes, good point.
You know, against a team like Tampa Bay, I feel like if you show any sign of weakness to them, they will do whatever it takes to exploit that. And so I'm not too sure if necessarily Tampa will win tonight. It's entirely possible given their history of bouncing back. But if they do, and if they're really to show up Shesterkin, in the Amalie Arena, I feel like this could be very concerning for the New York Rangers. But of course, Shesterkin, he's been fantastic this season. Shadow of Jacques Plante in terms of how good he was in the regular season, and of course in the playoffs he's been comparably just as good. One thing that is to mention, of course, is Andrew Copp, one of the players that they did acquire this around trade deadline. In the trade, they did have a conditional pick. It's their second that goes to the Winnipeg Jets. Yep. Now that they've made the conference finals, that becomes a first-round pick, so I guess Winnipeg has something to think about as they see one of their better players thriving on a new organization. But nevertheless, I think it's a great series so far, and I think it will continue to be that way until whoever wins. We'll just get into that right now.
Yeah. I thoroughly entertaining series. This one, I think they're two great teams, and I think that it has the ability to go to the distance. Moving on into predictions, it's a good way to lead into them. I think Tampa bounces back tonight, but I think it's going to remain close, the series. And I'm going to say Tampa in 7, despite the Rangers being up 1, just because you cannot doubt the Tampa Bay Lightning. You're not going to be able to necessarily bet. I can't really bet against them just based on what they've proven in the past. I made the mistake of doing that last series against the Florida Panthers. Got the Rangers right, but did not get the Panthers series right. And, you can't really bet against two-time Stanley Cup champion. And with the players they have on the roster, the pedigree that they have to be able to compete in games when it comes down to it, especially when it comes down to elimination, and with Andrei Vasilevskiy, who's building himself up to maybe one of the best, most clutch goaltenders of all time in NHL history. So, you can't really bet against them. I think the Rangers give them a very, very tough time. Rangers are a very good team, and they've shown that, but I'm taking Tampa in 7 games to go to the Stanley Cup final.
With all the information I've got, and with the fact that the New York Rangers, of course, won Game 1, I think I'm going to go with Tampa in 6. And my reasoning for this is this. All right, so Game 1, of course, went to the New York Rangers. Tampa's really good at bouncing back. Of course, Game 2 is still in the Madison Square Garden, but with that history of bouncing back, I see Tampa winning tonight. Shesterkin isn't necessarily great on the road throughout the playoffs. I see him dropping the 2 games in the Amalie Arena, making it 3-1 for the Tampa Bay Lightning. I think the next game at the Madison Square Garden, they do bounce back, and the New York Rangers make it a 3-2 series, but of course, with the home ice advantage, Tampa secures the series in 6, just given the, the history of Vasilevskiy being clutch in defeat, and furthermore, or I guess after defeat, and furthermore, the fact that Shesterkin hasn't necessarily been great on the road throughout the last 2 series. I think Tampa's going in 6.
Nice. Well, moving on to the other conference final series, that is the Edmonton Oilers and the Colorado Avalanche. We'll start right off with the Oilers, but first, actually, the Avalanche do lead that series 2-0 after they win 4-0 in last night's game. And moving back to Edmonton, we'll see if the Oilers can kind of rewrite the ship. But starting with the Oilers, they came into the playoffs with a 49-27-6 record, 104 points on the year. Leading points-wise in the playoffs for them is Connor McDavid, 8 goals, 21 assists, and 29 points in 14 games played. Absolutely superb, like we've mentioned in the past for Connor McDavid. Leon Draisaitl equally as superb for the offensively, that is, for the Edmonton Oilers. He's got 7 goals, 21 assists, and 28 total points in 14 games for the Oilers this year. Evander Kane rounds up the top 3 in points for the Edmonton Oilers, 13 goals, very good. 4 assists and 17 total points in 14 games, that is. And the starting goaltender, a lot of discussion has been put up around him. Mike Smith, 14 appearances so far this playoffs. He's got an 8-4-0 record. He's been pulled a couple times. A 319 goals against average, but a 916 save percentage. So interesting numbers for Smith, rounding up what's been a very interesting playoffs for him overall. Last playoff appearance was last year in 2021 when they got swept away by the Winnipeg Jets in the first round. And this year they took down the Kings in 7 before, of course, beating the Calgary Flames in the Battle of Alberta in 5 games. They go down 2-0 now against the Colorado Avalanche. Going to be interesting to see if the Oilers can find a way to bounce back against the high-powered offense that is the Colorado Avalanche.
Is Mike Smith the most interesting goaltender in NHL history? And I'm not talking about on a personality basis, but just in terms of not just playing style, but just the way he performs. Because this is a goaltender. I mean, you look at it. First of all, he plays every single puck.
Yes.
To his detriment.
Yes.
Now, of course,
yes.
He's a good playmaker. Trust me, he's one of the better playmakers in the league in terms of goaltenders. But when you play the puck to that frequency, to that degree, the amount of errors and slip-ups don't justify the positives that it would get from getting the puck down the ice faster or, securing the puck behind the net. I just don't see it. But it's not just that. It's also, you think of Jay Woodcroft's system. So Jay Woodcroft's system is basically trying to force guys to be outside to take low-danger chances. That's really the whole, meat and potatoes of his defensive system. Yeah. It's to force low-danger shots on net so that, in theory, the goaltender could save it. The problem is, it's Mike Smith in nets. And while Mike Smith can take he can make spectacular saves all the time.
Yes.
With those low danger chances. He's inconsistent, to say the least. And so I really struggle to see this series as anything but a crapshoot. I mean, yes, of course, Colorado has won the 2 games, and so they would get that advantage, but Mike Smith has also been fucking fantastic throughout this series in other regards. And so I think with goaltending, I mean, would they be better with Mikko Koskinen? Potentially. But, you know, Mike Smith can catch lightning in a bottle.
Yeah.
And so I don't know. It is the weirdest, easily the weirdest goaltender in NHL history in terms of performance, not necessarily in terms of the way that they play. That would probably be Tim Thomas, but nevertheless, wild. Or Rob Stauber. But one other thing that has to be mentioned, of course, is McDavid and Draisaitl. I mean, these are guys that easily some of the best in the league right now. I mean, McDavid, he's playing so good right now in the playoffs that people are arguing that he could be the best athlete at this very moment. So I think that's just a testament to how good Connor McDavid is and how good Leon Draisaitl is at supporting him, because he's been holding up his fair share of the bargain as well. Remember when people were saying that $8.5 million contract was terrible when it was signed?
Yeah.
Hindsight 2020, guys. Hindsight 2020. But it's not just that. It's also the defense. The defense has been solid. Cody Ceci has been pretty good. Darnell Nurse has probably been playing more minutes than he should be, which I think is a constant problem for the Edmonton Oilers. I think he's a good defenseman, don't get me wrong, but he makes mistakes, and those mistakes, especially in the playoffs, get amplified to a certain extent. And so I think it could be one of the ways that Colorado could exploit the team. And, of course, the forward depth has been great. You look at Josh Archibald, of course, a notorious figure, as some of the members of the Edmonton Oilers are, but Josh Archibald has been very good this playoffs. He's been a great forechecker. And same with Zach Kassian. Oh my God, Zach Kassian has had multiple breakaway attempts. Yes, he hasn't necessarily capitalized on them, but he's had very good chances. And this is a team that really, I mean, they could sink or swim. But against the Colorado Avalanche, you know, unless they have a life jacket on, I think we might know how it goes. But, you know, this is a team that just as easily could fly up into the stratosphere. So it's really a series to watch, to say the least.
Yeah. I think one example of what caps off Mike Smith's weirdness, last night, he just, I forget, it might have been the third goal, but he just lost his glove. Like, the glove just flies off. I'm pretty sure it just kind of flew off his hand. And then I think it was Brett Kulak who kind of played it back towards him. It's like Roman Cechmanek in 2003 against the Toronto Maple Leafs. I remember that from a long, long time ago. He lost his glove, and it came back to him, and then he goes down to put it on, but as he's looking down, the puck sails over his head and in the net. Smith is trying to get the glove back on, trying to protect his hand at the same time, but also trying to stop the puck. He does none, really. I guess he kind of protects his hand, but the puck ends up in the back of the net. It was weird. It was very Mike Smith, you know. Like, I was thinking to myself, if you're an Oilers fan, do you absolutely love Mike Smith, or do you absolutely despise Mike Smith because of the amount of heart attacks he must give you? You know, I don't know. He's an interesting figure.
You know what I love? I really love the fact that all the goalie references that we brought up so far, just between like Rob Stauber, Tim Thomas, Mike Smith, Roman Cechmanek. I mean, this is a guy who literally did whatever it took to headbutt pucks coming straight at him during the game. Yeah. And this is a guy who, I mean, he got so frustrated at his team whenever he was down like 3 goals that he would straight up give up playing. He would purposefully let goals in so that he could be subbed out. I mean,
Cechmanek, that is, yeah.
Yes, not Mike Smith. Yeah. Mike Smith sometimes looks like he does that, but yeah.
So, yeah, an interesting figure to say the least. And I think it's going to be interesting to see what the Oilers do to adjust because they clearly do need to make adjustments. And, I've mentioned this on multiple occasions in the past on this podcast. Last year, Vegas was able to shut down Colorado and take them down. The Blues did a very good job at doing so. The Oilers, they may not have the ability to do so just simply due to the fact that they lack the defensive depth and the forward depth in comparison to the team they're playing in the Colorado Avalanche. So, it's going to be tough for them to kind of bounce back and fight back in the series. But again, you have McDavid and Draisaitl, and the Oilers have overcome crazy leads in, Game one was a similar story where they were down. It looked like they were out. They came back, and they fight back in a ridiculous, ridiculous game. Game one against the Flames, same story. They're down, what, was it 6-1 or 6-2, and they fight back to tie the game. So you can never really count out that offense, especially when, if it's the end of the second period and they're down by 3, they get a power play, bam, they put one in. They're down by 2 going into the third. You can never really count them out. So, it's going to be interesting to see if they can bounce back in that regard and if McDavid and Draisaitl can find a way to bring back the dominance they had against the Calgary Flames, at least in my mind. And we'll move on right now to the Colorado Avalanche, a team that finished with 56 wins, 19 losses, and 7 overtime and shootout losses in the regular season for a total of 119 points. The playoff leaders so far for Colorado, Cale Makar leads the way with 4 goals, 13 assists, and 17 points in 12 games. Nathan MacKinnon is second with 10 goals, 6 assists, 16 points in 12 games as well. And Mikko Rantanen, he's got 3 goals, not really racking up the goal totals, but does have 12 assists and 15 points in 12 games played. The starting goaltender, well, this is an interesting one because Darcy Kemper has started for a majority of the playoffs in 10 appearances so far. He's got a 6-2-0 record with a 265 goals against average and 897 save percentage, not necessarily great in that category, but with Kemper going down with injury for, I guess, an undetermined amount of time, Pavel Francouz has stepped up to be really a very, very solid piece for the Avalanche in 4 games that he's come in, either in relief or starting in this series, or in this playoffs, that is. He's got a 4-0 record with a 248 goals against average and a 917 save percentage, so interesting dynamic going on between those two. In 2021, they defeated the St. Louis Blues in 4 before losing to the Golden Knights in 6, and this year they completely dismantled the Nashville Predators in the first round before beating the St. Louis Blues in 6 games, going on to face the Edmonton Oilers in round number 3. Again, maybe the bigger storyline for the Avalanche is Darcy Kemper and Pavel Francouz. Francouz has been great, but Kemper's their guy, and he has been throughout their playoffs. But I think the question stems from if Francouz does catch fire and he does really, really well for them, and Kemper gets healthy, what do you do? And that's obviously a good problem to have for the Avalanche, especially where they're at. They're in a very, very good position, 2 wins away from going to the Stanley Cup final. But kind of that's a dilemma that I think will have to be answered in the future if Kemper does come back, because Francouz has been very, very good for them.
Absolutely. I mean, I truly think Francouz is one of the most underrated goaltenders in the NHL at this very moment. He's always shown to be a very good regular season goaltender. Of course, not really getting the opportunity in the playoffs just because of the dynamic in Colorado with goaltending. And, of course, the injuries as well. But Francouz has really proven himself to be not just a capable backup goaltender, but really a guy who can step in as a starting goaltender throughout the series. And he's been fantastic. My question is, even though he does have a lot of experience in the KHL during the playoffs, does he have the ability to keep up as the series and as the playoffs drag on to really, stay consistently good as he's been doing throughout the playoffs so far? Because, if they do go through Edmonton and, all said and done, and they face off against a team like, for example, Tampa Bay Lightning or New York Rangers, I feel like they would definitely need their best goaltender or the best play from a goaltender in order to win the series, even though they have such a stacked team. I think, with the way that the New York Rangers have been playing and with the way that the Tampa Bay Lightning have always been playing, they're both teams that you can't really count out at this point. Which, I mean, yes, of course, once you get to this point in the playoffs, you shouldn't be able to count out, the team you're going up against. But nevertheless, Francouz has been fantastic. I mean, yes, of course, it's great that he's performing well, especially against some of the top NHL players like McDavid and like Draisaitl, which is just a testament to how good he's been playing. But also the fact that against deeper teams, against teams where he does have to worry about the third and fourth lines, and teams that really do have all four lines in terms of talent, like for example Tampa Bay. Just having that constant onslaught of offense. It'll be interesting to see if the Colorado Avalanche do end up making it past the Edmonton Oilers, which currently it's slated to occur, if they're able to keep that up.
Yeah.
But I do think that they have a lot of great players through and through. I mean, of course, there's so much to be said about their top six: Nazem Kadri, Nathan McKinnon, Rantanen, Landeskog, all playing wonderful hockey. Even guys like the Darren Helms and Andrew Coglianos have been really good. I mean, Cogliano, it's a miracle that he's still that fast at 34.
Yeah.
And it's kind of funny that, of course, he's going up against the team that drafted him in the Edmonton Oilers in this series. Yeah. And I think he even got a goal so far in this series as well. So I think that's so. Pretty ironic, but nevertheless, everybody has been doing what they need to do in order to succeed thus far. They just need to keep going. And with the way that the Edmonton Oilers have been playing, I think this series is becoming a lock. But like I said, you can never count them out.
Yeah. Moving on to predictions, I've got the Avs in 6, just because I do think the Oilers make certain adjustments and take a game at home before maybe... they take one at home and one on the road in Game 5, but they are going to fall in 6 at home. That's my prediction. That's my take. I don't think you can count out the Oilers really to go down without a fight. I think they've gotten to this point. Jay Woodcroft has instilled a very, very good system going on there in Edmonton. You've seen a lot of guys, and the structure of the way they've been playing is not necessarily doesn't necessarily in my mind have the ability to dethrone the Avs, but I do believe that they will put up a fight against Colorado, and I still think that it goes to 6 or 7. In this case, it goes to 6, and I'm taking the Colorado Avalanche to go to the Stanley Cup Final. So my Stanley Cup Final then would be Tampa against Colorado, setting up what I think is the battle of the Titans over the last 2-3 years, at least in the NHL, the two maybe best teams going up against each other over that time in the Stanley Cup Final. That's my prediction. We'll see if that is the case.
I would have to agree with your prediction in almost all points, just the main difference being in 5 instead of in 6. I think the way that Mike Smith has been playing certainly hasn't been up to snuff compared to, even round 2 or round 1, of course, where he had one of the best performances by a goaltender in the playoffs, besides maybe Jake Ottinger. But I do think they steal a game. I think with McDavid, that's almost a guarantee. I don't necessarily think they're going to get swept, although I was considering it. But I think with the series being down 2-0, and just the way that things are, and the fact that they don't necessarily have the depth, even though it has gotten better as the seasons have been going forward, and they do have Jay Woodcroft, a very capable head coach, especially one that's now proven himself in the playoffs. I see this going Colorado, Tampa in the finals as well.
Nice. So before we wrap up here, just some more news going on around the draft that's circulating that we kind of touched on at the beginning. Jake, if you want to jump in and kind of discuss what's going on there.
All right. So there has been some news that dropped during the podcast, and this is surrounding a certain player who was originally projected in the top 5, has slid throughout the year before, of course, us ending up finding out what happened, and that would be Yvonne Miroshanko. Now, this is a player who a lot of people said could contend for number 1. A couple years ago, he was looking like a very solid prospect. He did slide down to about a top 5 pick, which again is still very solid. But as the season has gone on, he hasn't necessarily been playing to the best of his ability. And of course, he was diagnosed with Hodgkin's lymphoma, which of course explains his drop in performance. He has, despite of course being diagnosed with cancer, his being from Russia, given the war, his draft rank hasn't necessarily slipped that far, especially when you compare to Timothy Liljegren, who of course missed a lot of his draft year with an illness as well. But he's still projected around the 15 range, but could slip as a early second rounder, depending on how things go. But there is some very good news on that front, as he has actually completed his treatments for cancer and is cleared to resume training. So definitely a good sign moving forward, and he will certainly be one of the players to watch during the draft. Definitely a wild card. This is a guy who's oozing with potential, but given the fact that, of course, with COVID the last couple seasons and battling cancer throughout this year, can definitely slide down the draft boards and could be a very intriguing pickup later on in the first round to whomever gets him. But yeah.
Definitely so. Well, I think that wraps everything up for today, unless we have something more to add, which I don't believe so. Mm-hmm. And if that is the case, well, as we mentioned, it's Friday, June 3rd. Game 2 between the Rangers and the Tampa Bay Lightning goes from Madison Square Garden in about an hour and a bit. So that's going to be interesting to see what happens there. And then Colorado and Edmonton re-up on Saturday night in Edmonton for Game 3 at Rogers Place. So we will see where that one goes. I'm very excited, very intrigued about what's next to come. And the next episode that we will be here for is the Stanley Cup Final preview. Again, some more discussions about the draft coming up and then potentially the offseason as well. So a lot still to come in the National Hockey League over the next couple of weeks, over the next few weeks. And of course, after that, we go into the offseason with the draft and with free agency. So a lot of stuff coming up, a lot of excitement going around, and overall a lot to look forward to if you're a hockey fan. So that concludes our podcast here this afternoon. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Jackson Starr, joined alongside Jake Titus. This is the J&J Podcast. We'll be back in a couple of weeks with the Stanley Cup Final preview, as mentioned. Hope you have a great day, everyone, and thank you so much for listening.